Dopamine is the molecule of motivation. And
the molecule of motivation.
Absolutely. I mean, for years and years, people thought dopamine was about pleasure, but dopamine is mainly about craving and motivation and drive.
Okay.
There's a simple experiment that illustrates that, but I would be remiss if I didn't first mention two excellent resources for people that want to learn a lot about dopamine. These would be perhaps interesting people for you to talk to directly. The first is a book called The Molecule of More, which is all about dopamine. The author is Huberman. I don't know him personally, but I love the book. I wish I had written it. The second is Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. And the author there is Anna Lemke, Lemke. She's a medical doctor and psychiatrist and runs the dual diagnosis addiction clinic at Stanford School of Medicine. She's a colleague. I consider her a friend, and she is world-class, second to none in all things dopamine as it relates to addiction. So wonderful reads. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is kind of paraphrasing elements from their book. So I want to be clear. So here's the experiment. Take two rats.
Yeah.
You give them a lever they can press, and they can get food out of that lever. They can get heat if their cage is cold. They can get all sorts of things that are great for a rat, including a mate to mate with if they press this lever. Both rats press the lever just fine. Now you take away dopamine from one of those rats. You can actually do that by using a toxin that can kill off all the dopamine neurons. Okay. There's an equivalent experiment that's been done in humans, but it was a naturally occurring death of these dopamine neurons, much in this same way that Parkinson's destroys dopamine neurons. What you find is that both rats or both people still experience pleasure from food, from sex, from warmth when they're cold, from cool when they're too warm, etc. However, if you take that rat, both rats, and you move them one rat length away from the lever, so they have to just do a little bit of work in order to press the lever. Or you take a human who has no dopamine neurons or very little dopamine, and you make the pleasureful thing a little bit more challenging to get to. The ones with no dopamine do not pursue pleasure at all. That's just one example of what now are hundreds of examples in the neuroscience literature showing that dopamine is the molecule of pursuit, craving, motivation, drive. Pick your favorite word.
So dopamine is a good thing in motivation.
Provided it's in proper levels,
right.
Yes,
okay.
That's right.
Okay.
If your dopamine is depleted, you will feel not motivated. Now, there's a double-edged sword here because many things, as you mentioned accurately, trigger dopamine release. Seeing a positive comment, a compliment, food, the more palatable a food, a really tasty chip compared to a slice of a potato that's baked but doesn't have anything on it, one truly releases more dopamine than the other. Right. I could list off a number of things, but we have a baseline level of dopamine. Nicotine, for instance, increases that by about 50%.
Gives you more dopamine.
More dopamine is released. You have two major dopamine pathways in the brain. There's one related to movement, one related to reward. Is broadly speaking. There are others, but broadly speaking, the so-called mesolimbic reward pathway. And then the other one, we don't have to throw out names, but that will just confuse people. But so you have these reward pathways, and dopamine is involved in movement. So nicotine, about a 50% increase. Cocaine, 100% increase, a doubling. Methamphetamine, 1,000 or even 1,000-fold increase.
Holy cow.
So huge increase in dopamine.
That's why it's so addictive.
So addictive, but what happens after that big dopamine increase is that the baseline levels of dopamine go below what they were before. How low that drop is below baseline is proportional to how big the increase was before.
That's why it's so addictive to stay on these things.
That's right. Well, and that's why if you're getting lots of little dopamine hits from things, as we call them, you're going to feel kind of depressed, and those things don't feel as rewarding anymore. Okay, now eventually the system can reset if you don't indulge. Let me give an example. This is a true story example. I out of respect for the individual, I don't want to reveal his name, but in talking about dopamine, someone I know has a child. The kid is in his 20s. He was a decent student, excellent athlete, really charming, nice kid. I've known him since he was little. And he reached a point where his friends had graduated high school. He went to community college, and he kind of fizzed out of that. He wasn't into that. This resonated with my earlier story. He was working a job, but then he wasn't feeling like working. And he was convinced he had ADHD, and he was depressed. And he started taking off down the path of medication, which, by the way, have helped many, many people. Most of the medications for ADHD, by the way, are drugs that increase dopamine. Because dopamine increases focus, it increases motivation, and it increases drive, essentially, the willingness to get into action in pursuit of goals, just like the rats that have dopamine or the humans that have dopamine pursue. The ones that have depleted dopamine do not. So this guy, who is a real story, was struggling in a major way. So about 3 months ago, he was watching a lot of videos online. He was texting a lot. He was mainly playing video games. Video games. But he wasn't really enjoying them as much anymore. And one thing you see with people with ADHD is they actually can focus if they're really interested in something.
Right.
Why? Because their dopamine levels are elevated and they're able to focus. He heard about the dopamine system and Anna's work, and I talked to him, and he decided to do what some people call a dopamine fast, but for him that meant no video games, and he did 2 weeks of no screens, which at first I think was agonizing for him.
Oh my gosh.
It's now 3 months later. It's a little less than 3 months later. I actually talked to his parent today, working full time, off all ADHD meds. Has a girlfriend. I don't know if that's related or not, probably because he's got his life together a little bit more, which is an attractive feature as opposed to someone who's, spiraling out, doing nothing, living at home, which frankly is an unattractive feature, regardless of, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever.
Yeah.
He's very focused on his work. He's excited by things, and he allows himself a short period of time each day where he plays video games, and he enjoys them again like never before. There is a simple explanation for this, which is that his dopamine system is reset. When you're constantly pursuing things, eating highly palatable foods, engaging in very stimulating anything, any behavior that's very stimulating, there's a drop below baseline, and it takes an increasingly great stimulus, high threshold stimulus, in order to excite you. So if people are feeling bored, unmotivated, unstimulated, most of the time it's because they are overindulging in things that keep pounding this dopamine system, but the baseline of dopamine is going down, 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 down. Now there are a few hacks that can actually help, and Anna talks about some of these in her book. The main thing is if someone is engaging in any truly addictive behavior or substance, or a behavior that just doesn't feel like it's that great, but you're finding yourself doing it compulsively.
Like what? What are some examples?
Texting, Instagram. I limit my Instagram time to 2 hours per day, which itself just sounds like a lot. I'm a grown adult, and I spend 2 hours on it, but I do a lot of work there, right? I'm trying to put out content that's educational.
You're creating,
but sometimes I think to myself,
lives,
like, I'm a grown man. I'm spending 2 hours a day on Instagram. Well, that's a lot of where we spend our time now.
Yeah.
But if you allow yourself 4 hours a day on social media, you'll probably find that you're scrolling, you're not even sure what you're looking for.
Like, what am I doing? Yeah,
Exactly.
I just wasted this time.
Exactly. And what you're looking for is something to jolt that baseline. So you want to limit those behaviors, or in some cases, if it gets really severe, like it was for this individual, you want to eliminate.
Completely, for 30, 60 days.
Ideally, it's 30 days. Now, this is the same prescriptive that they give alcoholics, heroin addicts, etc. But some of those drugs, of course, have actual withdrawal symptoms that can be problematic. These days, I'm not a pot smoker. I've never liked drugs or alcohol. I kind of lucked out that way. But and I'm not trying to demonize. I'm not passing judgment. But cannabis, for instance, is pretty in prominent use, and a lot of people. The idea of 30 days without that I think they probably say they could do it, but it would be very challenging for them. And I'm not here to tell people what to do, right? And there's about drugs, alcohol, or anything. But the idea is 30 days of no interaction with that thing, person, behavior, all sorts of things, so that you can enjoy other things. I like to say, addiction is a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. And if I may, enlightenment is a progressive expansion of the things that bring you pleasure.
Right.
All of that hinges on this dopamine system. So you have to be very judicious in your interactions with things that deliver pleasure, or else they will soon not deliver pleasure, and they will diminish your pleasure for everything else that you do.